So who really calls the shots in our economy? We're always told it's these neutral, super smart bankers and bureaucrats. But a fascinating book by Christopher Adolph, Bankers, Bureaucrats, and Central Bank Politics, argues that, well, maybe there's a different story going on, one that's driven a lot more by personal ambition and, future rewards.
And the whole idea really kicks off by taking a sledgehammer to a belief that a lot of us just take for granted about central bankers, what Adolph calls the myth of neutrality.
You see, for decades, the conventional wisdom has basically been this. Central banks were made independent to put up a wall, a shield, to protect the economy and us from politicians. The kind who might be tempted to just print a bunch of money to get reelected.
And this, right here, lays out that classic view perfectly. On one side, you've got the politicians, always thinking short-term about the next election cycle. On the other side, you've got the ideal central bankers. They're supposed to be thinking long-term, driven by data, completely technocratic, and just fierce hawks when it comes to fighting inflation.
Okay, but here's the puzzle. If making a central bank independent is the magic bullet, then why don't all the countries that do it get the same great results? Why is there such a huge variation in how they perform? The standard theory, it doesn't really have a good answer for that. To find that answer, we've got to look inside what the book calls the bureaucrat black box. See, we tend to get really focused on the rules of the institution, but we kind of forget to look at the actual people inside them. Who are they? What do they actually want?
It really boils down to something called the principal-agent problem. Just think of it like this. A government, that's the principal, hires a central banker, that's the agent, to go manage the economy. The government sets all the rules, sure, but the agent, the person who's actually doing the job, well, they have their own motivations, their own ambitions, their own career path they're thinking about.
And this quote from James March just hits the nail on the head. We've spent so much time building these abstract models and theories that we've kind of forgotten to study the real people making these incredibly important decisions in the real world.
So, how do we get to understand these real people? Well, the book argues that the key to unlocking this whole black box is actually surprisingly simple. You just have to follow their resumes. So what's the big piece of the puzzle that all the standard theories have been overlooking for all this time?
It was right there in plain sight the whole time, their career paths. The author argues that where these officials worked in the past, and, crucially, where they hope to work in the future, is maybe the single best predictor of the decisions they're going to make.
And this just illustrates the idea perfectly, doesn't it? A career isn't just some straight line. People weave back and forth between government jobs, the central bank, and the private financial sector. And all those past experiences, plus their ambitions for the future, well, that shapes their entire worldview and their incentives.
This brings us to a really powerful concept in the book, shadow principles. Okay, so what are they? Think of them as the big banks, the powerful firms, or the political parties that can offer a very lucrative next job. Now, they can't fire a central banker, they have no legal power, but they can dangle a very, very attractive carrot for the future, and that lets them influence decisions from the shadows.
Okay, I know this might sound a little bit theoretical, so let's look at a really powerful, real-world example from politics that just brings this whole idea crashing into reality.
So let's rewind the clock to the year 2000. Remember this? The U.S. presidential election between Al Gore and George W. Bush. It all comes down to one single state, Florida. And the vote is so ridiculously close that it triggers a mandatory recount. The whole country is holding its breath.
Now, the one person with the legal authority to oversee this whole mess is Florida's Secretary of State, a woman named Katherine Harris. But here's the catch. She was also, at the exact same time, the co-chair of George W. Bush's presidential campaign in Florida. A bit of a conflict of interest, you might say.
So what happened? Well, Katherine Harris made the incredibly controversial decision to use her authority to stop the recount. Bush was declared the winner. And what happened to her? Just 2 years later, Katherine Harris, who had been a pretty minor state politician, was elected to a very safe Republican seat in the U.S. Congress.
And this quote, wow, it's just unbelievable. 4 years later, you have another Secretary of State, this time in Ohio, Kenneth Blackwell, and he's facing a similar situation. He openly acknowledges this whole system of rewards. He's not afraid of being compared to Harris. He welcomes it, because he knows exactly where that controversial decision landed her. It's like he's saying it out loud for everyone to hear.
And look, this isn't just about politics. The same exact logic applies directly to economics.
The book's data shows this incredibly clear pattern. Central bankers who come up through the government, career civil servants, they tend to be associated with higher inflation. But the ones who come from the private financial sector, they are, as one source put it, the world's fiercest inflation hawks. Their resume basically predicts their policy.
So, all of this forces us to step back and ask a really fundamental question about what independence even means. Independent from whom, exactly? And the mechanism that makes all this possible is something we hear about all the time, the revolving door. It's that well-worn path from a government job regulating a certain industry to a very high-paying job in that exact same industry.
And this isn't some rare thing that happens once in a while. One U.S. study found that a staggering 2/3, 66%, of so-called independent commissioners went on to work for the very industries they used to regulate.
As a couple of insiders, Thomas Ferguson and Simon Johnson, put it so bluntly, this creates a situation where regulatory agencies can start to look like barely disguised employment agencies, where staff are basically auditioning, trying to make themselves look like an attractive hire for their next big private sector gig.
And that really leaves us with this final, and I think critical question. The whole system is supposed to create accountability to us, to the public. But if a regulator can make decisions that just happen to benefit a powerful industry and then gets rewarded with a multi-million-dollar job from that same industry, well, who are they really working for?